For more than 3 centuries, Worcester's newspapers have played an important role in the recording of its day-to-day history. In this series, we'll take a deep dive into the archives to uncover some of the fascinating stories documented within, in Worcester's printed past. With the onset of the Industrial Revolution, British society had begun a radical transformation. Across the country, new concentrations of factories were emerging, attracting more workers to urban centres. Towns which had previously had very small populations saw a rapid expansion of the populace. This dynamic shift in centres of population meant that certain areas of the country suffered from increasingly disproportionate representation in Parliament. Old Sarum, for example, had 2 elected members of Parliament in 1830, despite having no residents eligible to vote since the 17th century. Such places became known popularly as rotten boroughs. Meanwhile, Birmingham, now with a population of nearly 150,000, had no direct representation at all. With increasing levels of literacy amongst the urban working classes came an awakening of political consciousness, and an awareness that their interests were not being fairly represented. The percentage of those enfranchised to vote stood at a lowly 5% of the population, and people of all classes began to demand more of a say in British democracy. In March 1831, the government introduced a reform bill which proposed a series of changes designed to overhaul the system. Citizens of Worcester gathered at the city's Guildhall, where they held regular meetings to demonstrate their support for its passing. Despite overwhelming public support, the bill was defeated, first by the House of Commons and later by the House of Lords, eventually leading to eruptions of public disorder. In late October, riots broke out in cities across the country. At Nottingham, Derby and Bristol, the unrest was at its most fierce, with brutality displayed by both the rioters and the authorities who ruthlessly suppressed them. Disturbance at Worcester was comparatively mild, but it was enough to rattle the nerves of the Civic administration, and, but for their swift actions and resolve, could have escalated into something far more explosive. Saturday the 5th of November 1831 was an anxious date for Worcester's authorities. Another reform meeting had been scheduled to take place in the city on that day, to be held amid streets thronging with the usual crowds of the city's market day. The sense of foreboding was only increased by the date being the anniversary of the gunpowder plot. In such circumstances, the city administration decided to prepare themselves for a potential disturbance. 400 citizens were deputised as special constables, armed with staves and ordered to remain alert to the sounds of the church bells ringing out, their signal to assemble. Further to this, a troop of the 7th Hussars were stationed at nearby Droitwich, and 100 soldiers of the 91st Regiment of Foot were marched to Pershaw, there to wait in readiness. Besides these arrangements, the regular constabulary force of the city was placed in efficient state. The customary guards at the county and city jails were strengthened, and at the Bishop's Palace, the College Green in the vicinity of the cathedral, and other places likely to be singled out for attack, large bodies of constables were stationed under appointed superintendents. At length, all of these preparations seemed to be for nothing, as the fated day passed by peacefully. That is, until the nighttime drew in. The same quiet with which the evening commenced appeared to pervade every district of the city up to nearly 10 o'clock. The shops were mostly closed, the streets nearly cleared, and but one opinion seemed to prevail: that all the apprehensions entertained would pass off without realisation in the slightest degree. However, this was not to be the case. We scarcely know of any city in the kingdom of its extent that has enjoyed such immunity from the ravages of fire as Worcester. But, as ill luck would have it, this very evening, Shortly after 9 o'clock, the alarm was given that a conflagration had broken out in the back part of a Mr. Wokes, situate in the High Street. This occurrence taking place in the very heart of the city, in which there was much woodwork, and also in those adjacent, was in itself sufficient to spread terror for the devastation of property it might occasion. But connected with the peculiar circumstances in which the city was then involved, it caused general dismay and apprehension. The engines being speedily drawn to the spot, aided by the exertions of the neighbours, the flames were soon completely extinguished. But while the havoc of one element was being arrested, elements not less pregnant with mischief were rearing their heads. A few moments only had elapsed after the alarm of fire had been given before a large multitude had congregated upon the spot. It soon became evident that not a few were present who had been some time waiting in anxiety for the contemplated events of the evening. Their first proceeding was to get up a squabble around the engines, and we are told that some miscreant actually cut the hose of one of them. This sufficed to kindle a spirit of wanton folly and disorder amongst the mob. Their first incursion was into Foregate Street, where they attacked the windows of Mr. France the solicitor, and smashed a considerable number of panes. They also broke a few at the mansion of Sir Anthony Leshmere and some at the Cross. Those of the whole affray throughout at once bespeak the outrages to have had no connection with political matters, but to be merely prompted by a wicked spirit of indiscriminate violence and thirst for plunder. Returning from the Foregate Street to the Cross, an incident occurred to draw the attention of the rioters to the house of Mr. Hartin, the linen draper, and some few made an effort to force the entry door open for obvious purposes. Fortunately, however, in this they were defeated, but not until Mr. Hartin himself had sustained a severe wound from a stone. By this time, intelligence of what was happening had reached the mayor and the magistrates at the Guildhall, where they had taken up their headquarters for the night to be in readiness to act when needed. There was a large body of the special constables already assembled in the hall. At the word of command from the mayor, they sallied forth and encountered the rioters, and the streets immediately became the scene of conflicts in every direction. Several blows were exchanged in both sides. Many of the special constables were much hurt, amongst them Mr. Cripps, a wine merchant in Broad Street. A party of the rioters evinced a disposition to make a forcible entry into Mr. Cripps' well-furnished stores, and in the repelling of them, Mr. Cripps was knocked down, violently beaten, robbed of his eyeglass and some other property, and but for his rescue by some neighbours, more serious consequences would have ensued. But the aggressors themselves in many instances paid dearly for their sport, and several were captured and conveyed off to prison. The mayor, about 11:30 o'clock, deemed it right to send express to Droitwich and Pershall for the military. About 1:15, Captain Bathurst, with a troop of the 7th Hussars, entered the city and proceeded up to the front of the Guildhall at a smart trot. Their presence soon altered the tone of the mob, but still they continued assembled in large numbers, occasionally throwing stones at the soldiers. The soldiers bore their taunts and insults with exemplary forbearance. At length the mayor, to put an end to the excitement into which the city was thrown, determined on reading the Riot Act. It was 2 o'clock when the act was read from the steps of the Guildhall. A stone was hurled at the mayor and struck him on the head. Upon this, he directed the hussars to clear the streets. The troops immediately drew up across the street and, with swords drawn, proceeded to execute the command. The great mass of the tumultuous immediately took to their heels. Some, however, assaulted the soldiers and were slightly wounded in return. They made many prisoners and handed them to the special constables, who took them to the city jail. Several brickbats were thrown at the soldiers from the Bull entry, upon which one of the troopers charged the entry at full speed, his horse taking him down a flight of several stone steps in safety, and soon put a stop to this species of warfare from that quarter. But still the mob in the streets, as opportunity offered, continued to throw missiles at the men. However, Captain Bathurst's declaration that unless this was desisted from, the men would use their carbines, had the desired effect. Two fellows assailed Captain Bathurst at the top of Broad Street. The captain held but a brief parley with them. Riding between both, he grasped one with his bridle, the other with his sword arm, put his horse upon speed, and thus literally carried the two fellows dangling by his side into custody at the Guildhall. Many of the rioters sought refuge in the butcher's shambles, but in vain. The hussars pursued them even into these labyrinths. This decisive course of acting was what the mob was not prepared for, and although many still lingered in the streets, no further assemblage of them to any amount took place during the night. Some of the rioters had received sabre cuts and contusions, but the wounds were in every instance slight. A few men were posted at the Guildhall where the mayor and magistrates remained until 7 o'clock Sunday morning, but no further occurrence of tumult took place during the night. The outrages of the mob were almost confined to the principal streets. It is said a party attempted to enter College Green by Edgar Tower, and another showed some hostile intentions in front of the Bishop's Palace. But in both instances, they became soon warned of the reception prepared for them and hastily drew off. The aftermath of the riots in Worcester and elsewhere shook the government into action, and in the following years several new city police forces were established, including at Worcester in 1833. The first city police headquarters was established in St Nicholas Street. This force was only disbanded in 1967. The Reform Act was passed into law in 1832 and was the first step on the road to the universal suffrage of the modern democratic system in the United Kingdom.